name's Natalie Barber. I'm one of the rangers here at the park.
And I'm John George. I'm one of the park guides.
Yeah, and we're at of course, the Abraham Lincoln Birthplace National Historic Park in Hodgenville, Kentucky. And just to give you an idea of that location on a map, we're basically almost right in the middle of Kentucky itself. We're about an hour south of Louisville and 2 hours north of Nashville, Tennessee. So we're right there in the middle. And there are actually two parts to our park. There's the Birthplace unit, which is where we're broadcasting from right now. And then there is Knob Creek. So Lincoln was born here, lived here for a couple years, then went to Knob Creek for 5 more years before the family moved on to Indiana. Now, as far as the birthplace itself, when visitors arrive here, we have a visitor center that has some artifacts in it, a short film. There's a trail that people can walk if they're interested. But the key feature is what you're looking at right now. That's our memorial building. It's actually a little over 100 years old. It was finished in 1911. It's granite on the outside, Connecticut granite, and there's Tennessee marble on the inside. So you do have north and south contributing to the construction of this memorial building. And you're looking at 56 steps going up to the top, and that's symbolic. That's one step for every year of Lincoln's life. He was 56 years old when he was murdered in D.C. On the inside of it is one of the really key features of the park. A lot of people come to see that, and that is the log cabin. Number one question, is this Lincoln's cabin or is this a replica? The answer is neither. It's not Lincoln's cabin. These buildings were not created to last forever. Lincoln's was gone by the time he was really an adult. This cabin, though, is almost 170 years old. It's from the same era, right? Pre-Civil War Kentucky log cabin, kind of your standard starter home when you got land in Kentucky and started building. So it's very indicative of what Lincoln would have been born in, and very symbolic of his humble beginnings here in Kentucky. Basically, traditional style of that era. And there are 16 windows surrounding it in that building. That's symbolic as well. He was the 16th president, 16 rosettes on the ceiling. So there's a lot of meaning infused into that. But again, he was here till he was 2. After that, he moved to Knob Creek. And there's also a cabin at Knob Creek, which I'll get into that in a little bit more in just a minute. But Knob Creek is a significant portion of our park because this is where his first memories really take place. He's exposed to a lot of things at this farm that will follow him throughout his life and have a much bigger impact on him as an adult. He learns to work at this park, even though maybe 5, 6, 7 years old, you're still out working the farm. So he has memories of planting pumpkin seeds out here while the older kids planted corn. He has memories of the very next day of flood washing all that work away. So he learns grit and commitment to a job out here because there's no real time to feel sorry for yourself on the frontier. You basically get back to work and plant again. He learns about education. Just up the road was a blab school that he attended with his sister, his older sister, whenever they had a chance, really. It was only about 2 or 3 months out of a year on average that they would go to this blab school, a one-room log school about the size of the building you're looking at right now. They call it a blab school because the kids didn't have anything to write with. So they would all sit there on log benches cut out on the floor and basically shout their lessons all at once, which today would be maddening, but back then that's how they did it. And people write about hearing waves of just incoherent noise flowing out of these one-room log structures as kids recited their lessons. But that's how they did it back then. He learned about friendship at this farm. One of his best friends, Austin Gallagher, lived nearby, and actually some of the logs on that cabin belonged to the Gallagher cabin. So Lincoln saw some of those logs. So some of them date back to very early 1800s. And Austin actually saved Lincoln's life in the creek just behind that cabin. They were crossing over on a log. Lincoln fell in. Austin grabbed him, pulled him out. Was pounding on him, shaking him around on the ground until he coughed up the water and saved him. So a lot of memories come from that particular time period. And there was a road that you can't see it in the picture, but a road called the Old Cumberland Trail that passed by that cabin, a major thoroughfare. They'd have gotten news from the outside world from that road, from travelers passing by. They'd have seen soldiers from the War of 1812. They'd have seen slaves walking down that road, getting marched either to other plantations to work, being marched to markets to be sold. So he was exposed to slavery during this time period. His family did not own slaves. His friend Austin, his family owned slaves, so Lincoln would have seen slaves and would have seen slavery going on, but his father didn't. His father and mother were anti-slavery. They were members of an anti-slavery church, not exactly abolitionists, but they did not participate in that particular institution. So he didn't just learn about slavery, he learned about being anti-slavery in Kentucky as well. So a lot of memories from this. There is also a field at this site where the farm would have been. There's no farm there today, but you can see it's largely still undeveloped. There's a split rail fence that we put up there to give you an idea of how they would have enclosed it. But you're seeing the view shed that really Lincoln would have seen there as a little boy. So it's a really cool site. And again, it really symbolizes all these things that this Kentucky culture infused in Lincoln, learning how to deal with loss and tragedy. He lost a baby brother at this farm, so he has to learn to deal with that. He would deal with that later as a grown man, of course. Being exposed to slavery, which he would learn to deal with more as a grown man. And this culture, this Kentucky culture, this is a key point, would follow Lincoln into adulthood. A lot of the people who settled Indiana and later Illinois came from Kentucky. It was the same culture that settled those states. So I like to tell people that even though Lincoln left Kentucky at the age of 7, Kentucky never really left Lincoln. His wife was from here. His best friend was from here. All 3 of his law partners. The president of the Confederacy he would oppose in the Civil War, Jefferson Davis, is from Kentucky. So this state played a big role throughout his life. And if you guys are ever in the area or nearby going through Nashville or Louisville, we encourage you to stop by. We'd love to have you and show you around. So keep us on the map. So
Our theme for today is presidential power. And Lincoln is a perfect example to use for that, because he did some things while he was president that had never been done in the past by any other president. And it set the stage for later presidents to use his experience whenever they were faced with different crises in the country. Now, on the day that Abraham Lincoln became president, he was faced with the most difficult situation that any president before or since has ever experienced. The nation was a house divided that was splitting apart and headed for civil war. For years and years, the nation had been in conflict over the institution of slavery. States that allowed slavery and those that did not argued over whether the institution should exist at all, and over whether slavery should be extended into the new territories that the United States was gaining in the West. A series of compromises between the two had been put in place to resolve some of these issues. Those ended up being more or less temporary fixes. The conflict was so strong that it eventually reached the point where compromise wouldn't work anymore. When Lincoln, who, as you know, was personally opposed to slavery, was elected president in November of 1860, many of the slave states felt that his election would bring an end to slavery. Between his election and his inauguration, 7 states seceded from the Union and formed the Confederate States of America. Lincoln wanted to preserve the Union at all costs and had said that he was willing to leave slavery alone if that's what it would take to put the country back together. He believed that the president did not have the power to end slavery, that only the states could make that decision for themselves under the United States Constitution. Lincoln, of course, was a lawyer, and he strongly believed in the rule of law, and that, as a nation based on law, the Constitution was the chief protector of the rights of citizens. When he took the oath of office, he swore to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. But shortly after he took office, the Union and the Confederacy went to war. More slave states joined the Confederates, although others, such as Kentucky and Maryland, remained in the Union. In these border states, sympathy with the Confederates was high. There was a real danger that these states would leave the Union. There were riots in Baltimore, Maryland, when troops from the North came through the city on their way to Washington, D.C., and the Maryland legislature was about to meet and decide if that state would also leave the Union. That was Lincoln's greatest fear. He instructed the Army to resist any effort by people in Maryland to secede, including arresting people who said or printed things that supported the Confederates. Now, I want to ask a question. There's no real particular correct answer to this, but what are some of the issues, constitutional issues, with that order that Lincoln has given? When you think about the Bill of Rights, anybody want to give that a shot?
None of us are kind of sure.
Well, what are you thinking? Thinking about the Bill of Rights and the president just. What about free speech?
Yeah.
You know,
Do you want to expand on that?
I don't know.
Jill, give it a shot.
Maybe. I don't know. Would it be like?
well, think.
I don't know.
Go ahead. Well, think about in the Bill of Rights, you have the right to free speech. That's there for a reason. That you know, in the past, when you had kings, you know, you couldn't say anything bad about the king, and you would end up in prison or worse. But it's guaranteed in the Constitution. So, if people are saying things that support the Confederacy, don't they have the right under the Constitution to be able to say that? You know, even if it's not the popular opinion or what the government wants to hear. Also think about things that were newspapers that might have printed something that was pro-Confederate. Well, you have the freedom of the press. You know, there is a right to protest. But that's the beginning, and you see how it's a tricky thing to on one hand you're upholding the Constitution, but on the other side of this, you're watching your country come apart. Kind of keep that in mind as we go ahead. Now, of the people that were arrested in Maryland, one of the most important and well-known cases was that of a man named John Merriman. Merriman was a planter, and according to some, he supported the Confederacy and was the leader of a group that intended to fight against the Union. One night, soldiers came to his home and took him into custody, and they carried him to Fort McHenry, where he was detained. Now, what famous event in American history occurs at Fort McHenry? You don't want to answer?
What was the question?
What famous event in American history took place at Fort McHenry, where John Merriman was taken? In Maryland, Baltimore.
Yes.
Think about the national anthem.
The Battle of 1812. Throwing it out there.
Well, it was during the War of 1812. Baltimore, the city of Baltimore, was under siege by the British forces, and Francis Scott Key witnessed this from a prison ship and wrote the Star-Spangled Banner. And that's where that comes from. It's at Fort McHenry, which is a Park Service site you should visit sometime. Now, Merriman's lawyers made a petition for his release because there was no warrant issued for his arrest or any formal charges made against him. That petition was for what you call a writ of habeas corpus. Now, habeas corpus is Latin for you have the body. Basically, that's saying that you have this person in your custody. You have control over this person. it requires that an official brings a prisoner before a court and justifies why they've been arrested. Specifically, what crime have they committed? If the charges can't be justified, the prisoner must be released. Now, the idea of habeas corpus has been around for centuries, first in England and then in the United States, and was a response to the time when a king could imprison anyone who disagreed with them and hold them prisoner for as long as they wanted, in some cases for years, without ever being charged with anything. Lincoln's order to the army that they arrest people suspected of being disloyal was a suspension of the writ of habeas corpus, which was allowed in the Constitution, but only in times of rebellion or invasion. Merriman's case was quickly taken before Roger Taney, who was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and a man that was widely believed to be a Southern sympathizer himself. Taney ruled that it was Congress and not the President who could suspend the protection of habeas corpus, and that Merriman should be released. The Constitution doesn't clearly specify which branch of the government has that power. Taney based his ruling on the fact that the suspension of habeas corpus was included in Article 1 of the Constitution, which specified the power and duties of Congress, rather than Article 2, which outlined the power and duties of the President. Now, people that disagreed with Lincoln accused him of violating his oath of office by taking a power that belonged to Congress. And Lincoln defended that action because the nation was at war. And as Commander-in-Chief, he had to act quickly to preserve the Union. He didn't have time to gather Congress and have them debate the matter. Lincoln felt that it was a greater violation of his oath to allow the country to fall apart rather than not act because of the habeas corpus protections for people that could be potential enemies. What do you think are maybe some issues going on in our time that might have some similarities to that? Things within the last few years.
Everybody's offended by everything, so if you do something wrong, I mean, anything, really?
Well, think about
like ISIS, maybe,
exactly.
There's still
being here.
there's still racism and just kind of I don't know.
Think about our war on terror and the fact that we, let's say like Guantanamo Bay, where we have terrorists that have been detained, and because they are enemy combatants, are classified as such, they can be held. Now, this is a case of, Lincoln used it first, but it's been used by other presidents. Now, as it turned out, Lincoln basically just ignored Taney's ruling. With the country at war, it really kind of deflected some of, he received a lot of criticism for it, but everyone was really preoccupied with, the battles and the events that were going on. Later on, Congress went ahead and approved of Lincoln's decision to suspend habeas corpus, which that settled a lot of the issue, but it's still, the suspension of that right remained in place in some places for the rest of the Civil War. Merriman himself was eventually charged with treason. Some friends of his made bail, and he got out of jail on bail. He was scheduled to have a trial. It was put off many, many times until finally the war was over. A couple of years after the war, the charges were finally dropped. Now, one of the other actions that Lincoln took during the Civil War was the Emancipation Proclamation. basically an executive order. This eventually led to the end of slavery in the United States and the reshaping of the nation. Now remember that Lincoln initially did not feel that the president had the power to end slavery, and that was a decision left for the individual states to make. And Congress agreed with this position. But in 1862, the nation was still locked in a bloody and terrible civil war. Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation as a war measure that would go into effect on January 1st, 1863. That would free all the slaves in places that were still fighting against the Union. It did not free the slaves in places like Kentucky that were still part of the Union. Now, the Emancipation Proclamation is often described as a war measure. Now, think about how freeing slaves would affect the South and could affect the war. Could y'all give me some ideas you have about what was the purpose for this war measure to free slaves in places that were still in rebellion?
Because then the slaves that were freed could fight for us, I guess, or the side they were freed on.
Exactly. That's one. You think about the major labor force in the South were enslaved people. And so while soldiers are off fighting the war, you still have people tending the fields and all of this. When you take away that labor force, you really cripple the Southern war effort. And of course, it did allow for the first time for African Americans to serve in the Army, and thousands did. And it was another great benefit for the Union side. Now, Lincoln's basis for issuing the Emancipation Proclamation was his war powers that are reserved to him as Commander-in-Chief. The proclamation was a war measure that was intended to hasten the end of the war. And over time, Lincoln had come to realize that the country could not come back together if slavery did not end. It could no longer remain a house divided, half slave and half free. There had been too much destruction and too much blood lost for things to ever to return as they had been. You could imagine that if they tried to reunite the country and then just go back to the way things had been before, after all of these people had died and all of this had happened, it just was not going to be something that could work. Now, one thing about the Emancipation Proclamation is even though it did not end slavery, it started about the process that eventually led to the adoption of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which did abolish slavery. And like I had mentioned earlier, other presidents have used Lincoln's thinking to, in their own times of trial. Later presidents used Lincoln's example to increase executive powers in times of crisis, and during World War I, President Woodrow Wilson established a Committee on Public Information that encouraged citizens to report people suspected of undermining the war effort. And a lot of times immigrants were people that were targeted by this, because you are dealing with a foreign war in Europe. And so people that had just come to America from Europe were suspect in many people's eyes. There were acts that were passed that allowed for Wilson to crack down on anyone who wrote or said anything against the government or the military. Now back to the Constitution and the idea of free speech and free assembly and freedom of the press. This is a presidential power that in normal times nobody would tolerate the suspension of these rights. But presidents do have that that option when they feel that the circumstances call for it. One of the worst examples of this was in the early days of World War II, when President Franklin Roosevelt issued an executive order that forced over 100,000 Japanese Americans into internment camps. It was feared that they would side with Japan during the war. These citizens were detained without any indication that they had done anything wrong. There were no investigations of disloyalty, and they were never put on trial. We also have a Park Service site, Manzanar, in California, which is one of the sites of one of those internment camps. So as you can see, Lincoln may have been the first to set these things into motion, but he was not the last, and will not be the last president who has to use these powers. Now, we can open this up to questions. If y'all have any questions or comments, and you can ask us any things about Lincoln. It doesn't necessarily have to be on what we just talked about. You can ask us some questions about Lincoln and about this park or anything.
Okay, if we needed any information in the future as far as making projects, where could we contact you if we could?
Well,
we do have we have a Facebook page that's pretty active. You could always send a message through our Facebook page. Which, by the way, some pages will imitate national parks on Facebook. It's always the Facebook page with the arrowhead. That's the key. Is to always look for the arrowhead with Abraham Lincoln Birthplace National Historic Park on Facebook. You could always at nps.gov. We are on there, and you could always give us a call, and they'll forward you to any of the rangers here who'd be glad to help. It'd be nps.gov/ABLI. The first two letters of Abraham Lincoln. And you could get the phone number off there and give us a call. We'd be glad to talk to you. So those are the two most expedient ways of getting help. So
we would certainly enjoy if helping you with any project you might be doing.
Absolutely.